Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Changing the Narrative, conversations about race, equity, and beyond. My name is Kristi Lansana. I'm the director of the Center for Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. And we are happy that you have joined us for this Black History Month conversation in this series. The conversation topic today, Enacting the Blueprint, Historic Preservation, and Community Building for the Greenwood Community. The Changing the Narrative series is produced in partnership with the Center for Public Life, the Center for Poets and Writers, the Center for Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation, Tri-City Collective, and the Center for Africana Studies. And today's conversation was being led and curated by the director of the Center for Africana Studies, Dr. Erica Townsend-Bell. And so Erica, thank you. And I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce our guests, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, and hello, everyone. Yes, I have the pleasure and the privilege of curating today's series, and it is very much a curation with our three experts here who we are excited to hear from. So I'm going to introduce each of them briefly, and then we will commence with some conversation. So again, we're addressing this topic of enacting the blueprint, historic preservation, and community building for Greenwood and beyond, right? So thinking about the overlaps between the Greenwood community, other Black communities in Oklahoma, and further flung. So we have with us in alphabetical order, Brenda Nails-Alford, who is a founding Greenwood Rising Board member, former chair and current member of the Tulsa Mass Graves Public Oversight Committee, former Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission Grants Committee member, among many other things. And I should say, I'm going to give you all a brief introduction, but if there are things that I've missed or that you especially want to highlight, please do share that as you begin your comments at any point. We also have with us Gina Sofola, who is AICP and president of Sofola and Associates. And we have with us Kristi Williams, who wears many, many hats. Freedmen, Greenwood Descendant, author, chair of the Black Wall Street Tour, community activist, and chair of the Greater Tulsa African American Affairs Commission, among, I'm sure, other things. So thank you all for being here with us today. I'm really excited about this conversation. And so this is, we're thinking about this in the context of Black History Month. And so I think we'll start with the history, and then we'll make our way towards the future, right? What we want to see. But thinking about the history, Oklahoma is known for its Black towns, and to varying degrees, its Black neighborhoods, right? Or its Black districts, both urban and rural. And so I wonder if we could start with you, Sharon. Can you speak to the importance of these spaces and what role they play historically? So the question is the importance, the historical importance of Black towns and Black communities, Greenwood in particular, but more generally speaking, throughout Oklahoma. Historically, what role do these play for you, right? Or what is the relevance of a conversation about these spaces?
Who are you asking the question to?
It's the floor is open. Sorry if I didn't communicate that. So anybody is welcome to weigh in. I'm not sort of going to call names, right? Anybody's welcome to weigh in at any time.
I'm sorry, I thought you specifically asked for Sharon or someone like that. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Oh, excuse me.
No. Okay. I'll jump in then. The role is very important. I think districting in and of itself is an important aspect of city planning and an important aspect of helping cities to realize some economic success for businesses or aspects of community that want to come together under under an umbrella of unifying some theme or promoting some agenda. And usually that agenda is for economics purposes. And so districts play a really important part in making that a reality. When you start talking about the importance of that in an African-American context, I think it's in some ways doubly important because one, if you really look at, when you think about historically what we had in the past, we in effect, even though we were operating under segregated laws and in a segregated society, we in effect had a district. We had, in effect, created a district within these red lines that we were bound within. And that districting context helped us to be economically viable. You know, we could not, or were not, for all intents and purposes, selling beyond our borders. We had a captive audience, and people were buying and selling within the boundaries of our communities. And so our dollars stayed in our communities. And I mean, this is all statistically known. We sort of have had this conversation several times, but maybe not within the understanding that in effect, what we were operating within was a district in and of itself.
Well, I'll jump in. My name is Brenda Nails-Alford, and I'm a descendant of race massacre survivors and Black Wall Street entrepreneurs. And I grew up in the Greenwood district. And I have to say that it was a joy to grow up as a little kid in a community that was just so loving, encouraging, and the call of the community was to get your education and work hard and be successful. And we saw that in the members of the community, our family members and our community members, that gave us, first of all, so much of themselves because they were so proud of the community themselves, and they passed that down to us. And I want us to get to a place to where we have that opportunity to give to generations after us to be able to experience that. It was so wonderful to experience businesses and entrepreneurs in the community when I was growing up. I got a taste of that. To attend a school in the community, I attended the old Dunbar Day Nursery and Charles S. Johnson that were located in the old Booker T. Washington High School building that was located in the Greenwood community at that time. And so it's just a sense of pride, if you will, to be able to have that experience and just to be able to share that with others as you go along.
And I'll take it from a historical perspective. When we talk about the Black townships, and even the native Black towns, the tribal towns that's not mentioned usually. And then when you just talk about the whole historical perspective when it comes to land, Oklahoma was the only place, well, actually Indian Territory before it was Oklahoma, was the only place that Black people could actually own land. And so just being able to teach that to our children is critical to build our children into the entrepreneurs and just wanting them to take that back. History is just really a study of societies, behaviors, so that we can make better decisions. When you can study that, you'll learn how to make better decisions. And land has been crucial to the Black communities, to Black development, period, which is why this country has fought to keep land from us since we got here. The Homestead Act of 1862, right? The 40 acres and the mule that General, what's his name? Sherman, General Sherman awarded, and it was taken back by President Andrew Johnson. because they knew what was happening, right? They knew what would happen if we owned land. And then you go to the Red Summer of 1919, when you see successful Black communities, they burned them all down. And so it's really important that we use those historical occurrences and teach that. Until we have to teach that to our children and to adults, because there are a lot of adults who don't know that. And so we have to do that to give our children the power to take back our land and our communities, not just in Oklahoma, but across the country. And I keep telling people all the time, when we talk about Black history, Oklahoma should be the first testament if Black history was a Bible, because it really, it's a beacon of Black history that sets the tone for this country and for the world.
Yeah, absolutely, right. So absolutely. So we have then, I think, you all were referring to Oklahoma as a land of opportunity to some degree for Black and for Native people at a particular moment that we are always so attentive to. And then a real shift by the time we get to the turn of the 20th century. And some real and the increasing boundaries, right, and variety of ways that are put in place. But that nonetheless, and this is really Derek Bell. I mean, there's many people I think who have spoken to this, right? But Derek Bell is certainly, one really notable name among them, who really reflects back on the ways in which, sort of prior to the civil rights movement, Blacks and the community that they built created, to your comments in particular, Brenda, right? This, this experience of community. Right, in all of its dimensions, the economic dimensions, the relationships, and we see the destruction of that with the race massacre, but then the rebuilding of that again for some decades to come, and then we move into this phase of real disinvestment. Right, a new phase, I should say. I shouldn't say real as if it was the first, but a new and critical phase as we move into the 1950s and the 1960s, this phase of disinvestment that have really restructured the contemporary relationship of Black folks to the communities of the past. And so I'm curious your thoughts on this element, right? What is the contemporary relationship to the Black community, to Black towns, to other spaces of Black majority? And what should it be?
For me, basically, yes, it's a responsibility to us to, as Kristi said, know your history, know who you are, know where you come from, because it's like the old saying goes, when you know better, you do better. And growing up in a community such as the Greenwood community, we grew up proud of our community. Many of us, as I've shared in other platforms, did not know about the race massacre aspect of our family history. I grew up knowing about our family businesses, but I did not know about the race massacre aspect of it until I was grown, and all my family members that knew about it were gone. But doing the research and pulling our family history together, I mean, it's just been so rewarding to me, and it's an ongoing process. But I also want to say, when you talk about boundaries, growing up, we saw people of color that looked like us. They were our teachers, they were our pastors, they were our business owners in that community. But in the mid-60s, my father would buy our first brand new home further north in the Mohawk Boulevard area of Tulsa. And that was my first experience at diversity in the community, because at that time, North Tulsa was predominantly white Tulsa, okay? And our neighbors were white. And it was a situation where you had everything that you needed and wanted in a community. You had Northland Shopping Center that was very vibrant at the time, excuse me. You had name brand grocery stores around every corner. You had bowling alleys. You had, anything that you needed and wanted in a community just blocks away from the community that we were in. Granted, we had, those same things in the Greenwood district to a certain extent, but not to the extent that that was held just blocks away from us. So, I say that to say that, and when I tell people that story, sometimes, especially young people, they don't believe me. And it breaks my heart to know that, they can't even sometimes envision something like that. And so my platform a lot of times is, it's not about let's finally bring it to North Tulsa. It's let's bring it back bigger and better, because it was there. Yes, the makeup of the community was different, but we have the wherewithal to provide the sustainability that is needed to do so.
I was gonna let Gina go ahead.
Well, I was gonna let you jump in because I've got a lot of thoughts sort of going around in my head in terms of I could take this in a couple of different directions. So go ahead, please.
And I just want to clarify, Erica, you were talking about what is the relationship now, or what it should be now as it pertains to building communities. I love Dr. Claude Anderson, and I love when he said that Black people don't have communities anymore. And he's absolutely right, we don't. We have neighborhoods where mostly we sleep there, but we rarely eat there, right? We don't work there. We just sleep there. And it is critical that we build our communities. And you can intellectualize this, you can have all the panel discussions about this, but until we get to a point where we can truly, and I mean truly, self-examine ourselves and how damaged we are from over 460 years of white supremacy that has abused us mentally, physically, and spiritually, is the only way we're going to be able to build back our communities. We have to come together as Black people, and we have to have we have to have our own code of ethics. We have to have shared principles and shared values that we agree upon as a people before we can move forward. We have to learn how to build an economy within an economy. And that means shopping in our communities, building businesses in our communities, building businesses that where you can hire employees with living wage jobs. It is those things, it's going to take those things. But until we have to look inside and understand, because all of us have white supremacy within us. And until we recognize that and start to heal that within ourselves, we'll never get to where we want to go. The Super Bowl was a prime example of that. You see the NFL has been just a plantation. One of the largest ran living plantations today. You've seen what happened with Kaepernick, Brian Flores, their openly racism system that they operate within, yet you had majority of Black people excited at the watching it and excited about the halftime and seeing Snoop Dogg and everybody crip walking. And nobody is crip walking to City Hall. Nobody is really putting those efforts into what's important. And that is because of that mental abuse that we have from white supremacy. And we have to address that. I mean, we have to address that until we do, we are not going to get back to what we once had, which is the legacy of Greenwood, Black Wall Street, Oklahoma, Rosewood, all these other towns across this country. It means nothing to our young folks now. We tell them those stories, and like Brenda said, they don't want to believe those things. It's hard for them to see that. But we have to teach our kids principles, values as it relates to Black people. We got to stop partying. I always say my mom and my dad would never let me go outside until I cleaned up the house and had my chores done. Then I could go out and play. And we got work to do. We got to clean up. And it's okay to unify with white folks, but we have to clean up ourselves first, and then we can go out there and play. But until then, it's going to be the same thing. We're going to be on these panels again, talking about this over and over. So yeah, stop me because I'll keep on going. Y'all got to tell me to shut
No,
up.
I love that. Okay, I do. I love it because I love your answer, and I love it within also the context of this series talking about changing the narrative, because that is exactly what is necessary. I did not come to this. I don't live in Tulsa. I live in Oklahoma City. And I grew up here in Oklahoma City. I was not born in Oklahoma City. I was actually born in Lagos, Nigeria. My father was Nigerian, but my mother came from the Tulsa area. I knew nothing about Greenwood and the burning. I knew nothing about that history. I learned about that history when I graduated from college and moved to New York. And it was a friend of my ex-husband's who was a history major who told me about Black Wall Street. And I almost didn't believe him. I almost challenged him myself, because growing up in Oklahoma, I never knew that history. And I used to carpool with Clara Looper, Miss Looper. My mother and Miss Looper were sorority sisters, and I rode in the backseat of the car combing her daughter's hair every morning. Okay. So Miss Looper was a history teacher at my high school, and I did not have Black history as a requirement for my class, for my curriculum. So I never had the opportunity to really learn that history. It wasn't until I came back to Oklahoma City after 23 years. And I came back to Oklahoma City in 2004 and came back totally believing that God had sent me back for such a time as this. There was a reason for my coming back. And I was immediately thrown into the work that I have been doing now for almost 20 years. And that was the restoration of the historic Douglas here in Oklahoma City. But what was very interesting is, as I was thrown into that work, that took me into this sort of historical research. And again, that's when I found out just how rich Oklahoma was in African-American history, not just Oklahoma City, not just Tulsa, but the entire state. And from my perspective, I always immediately said, we are missing a tremendous opportunity. Not only are we as African-Americans missing a tremendous opportunity because of lack of knowledge and or lack of an understanding of what it takes at the table and what it really takes to rebuild communities. But the state is missing an opportunity. And the state is missing an opportunity because we have not embraced our own history. I'm going to tell you something. This is not something I have shared with a lot of people, but maybe this platform, and maybe because I'm turning 60, I don't care anymore, and I can share I can talk about whatever I want to talk about. But when I first came to this country, I was ostracized. As a little girl, I was made to feel inferior because I was from Africa. And I was made to feel that way from people within the African-American community. I never lived in a white community until I left Oklahoma. I always lived in an African-American community. So I left an African country where everybody was Black. I didn't know leadership outside of Black people, to come to Oklahoma City and into an African-American community where I saw Black doctors, Black lawyers, Black librarians, Black pharmacists, Black teachers. Everyone in my sphere of influence was Black. And then on top of that, I was exposed to not only Black leaders, but Black excellent leaders and community members who, yes, if I did something wrong, it did take a village to raise me, because if I did something wrong, a community member was free to deal with me, and a community member was free certainly to tell my parent, my mother, who then would deal with me. And so that sense of connection, that sense of accountability ran deeper than just what is, certainly deeper than what we see today. We don't have anything like that today within our own communities. And so as Oklahoma City's community, as its east side began to expand and began to grow, sure, the morphology of the area, naturally we migrated into areas because of that were white, that were predominantly white, and they began to change because the cycle is exactly the same when you start talking about cities and how they grow. And I remember coming back to Oklahoma City for a visit one day and watching people move to Edmond, which was a city that is a suburb of Oklahoma City that literally became probably the second largest city in this metropolitan area because of white flight. But what was interesting is that we followed them. And what was even more interesting then, I said, I remember watching just the traffic patterns and seeing what was happening and seeing who was in the cars that were in the traffic, right? And remember thinking, we are positioned with the best real estate in Oklahoma City right now, African Americans, and yet we are running to Edmond or running to Moore or running to these other communities because we think for some reason that they have something better than what we have. And this was definitely more than 20 years ago when I remember having this experience. And I remember telling my brother, in another 20 years, they're going to come back and take the property that we now have that we're abandoning and leaving. And then we're going to follow them again back. And then though we will not be able to afford the property that we had in the first place, where we could have been the beneficiaries of that economic growth or economic boom if we had been willing to stay in our communities and build our communities and understand the value of building those communities, understand, like you said, Kristi, the value of land ownership. And don't get me wrong, we have certainly had structures that have dismantled that and have buried things that have tried to keep us and take that away from us. Oklahoma City has its own story with urban renewal policies of the 70s and dismantling of our neighborhoods, which then scattered us. And so I don't want to take or diminish the role that those types of structures and those types of policies and powers that be, the impact that they had on us. That is not what I'm trying to say. But it is so important for us to recognize, to change the narrative and to recognize what it's really going to take and to be committed to it. Most of us are not committed to it. One, we don't know. We don't know what it takes. And because we were never at the table. And so we don't understand the policies. We don't understand how they do things or why decisions are made. And so that definitely gave us a disadvantage. But now there are many of us who are at the table. We've been at the table for a while. And instead of leaving our communities, it's now time for us to come back to our communities, be committed to our communities, teach our communities, empower these communities, make the road and the pathway clear for other people to come through, and leverage the knowledge that we have and put it to work so that we can rebuild. So when you ask the question, what is the contemporary relationship? The contemporary relationship is not to look at the powers that be, if you will, to reinvest in our communities. The contemporary relationship really has to start with us reinvesting in our communities, because what we have assumed, we have taken on this slave posture, and that is that the master is always our source. He is the source and the sustainer, okay? And we have to change that narrative, because when we look at white communities, and if you just peel back everything, just peel back racism for a minute and look at how a white community is built. It is built with investment from within from the people within the community. Now, certainly they don't have barriers to keep them from excelling and accelerating, but nevertheless, if you peel all of that back, they build their businesses, they sell within their own community, they take care of their homes, they invest in their homes, they see it as an asset. In some cases, the only asset that they have to lead to retirement. I mean, there are many people in other communities that they buy a home and they invest in that home. I mean, they beautify that home because they know it's an asset that appreciates, and they keep that home, and either they will leave that home to the next generation. And even when they leave it to the next generation buys it. They don't just walk into it generally, they purchase it. And so they are constantly recycling money within their own community. And we need to, one, understand that process, come to the table, understand it. Those of us who know, make sure we're educating and empowering others. And two, be committed to doing it.
Yeah, to your point, that reinvestment attitude is absolutely correct. We have to have investment in our own communities, as you said. I can remember during the urban renewal times, I was probably a preteen teenager at the time in the Greenwood district. We saw how our family and community members felt about the changes that were going on in the community at the time, losing, for many of them, their community for the second time. I remember as a little girl, people in the community standing on the corners, begging people not to sell their homes, their businesses, because they saw what was coming. And it was very well known in our family that our property, our home was never to be sold in the Greenwood district. And to this day, we're almost in 2025, we will have owned our property, the last property that my grandparents built or purchased in 1925, for almost 100 years in one family. But they were very, very clear on that because they knew what could happen. I remember conversations amongst the adults in the community about how, man, we send them off to college, they do good, but they won't come back and support the community. And that did something to me. My father buying that brand new home in further North Tulsa, and witnessing the times when we saw more of our people moving north at that time in the white flight to other communities, that did something to me. And I promised myself that if I ever had the wherewithal, I was going to build that home that I saw in those Pareto homes and other places in North Tulsa. And I'm blessed that my husband and I were able to do that here in North Tulsa, because we have to show each other that, yes, we can do this, but we have to be the source of reinvesting in our own communities to bring our tax dollars here. We have to do what they told us to do. Don't just talk the talk, walk the walk. Put your money where your mouth is. Bring your tax dollars, to the community. We have to do that with each other and for each other.
And there's such a specific reason just in the city economics or the community economics. There are specific reason for doing that. You brought up the issue of tax dollars. I think the majority of us do not really understand, or maybe we've heard it, but we don't really comprehend the full ramifications of bringing those tax dollars back to our communities. When white flight occurred, and then when we followed, for instance, or when our communities were dismantled by hook or crook, however the process occurred, the dismantling of these communities also dismantled the economics, the education. It dismantled so much because of the tax dollars that went with that dismantling. So everything is connected. I mean, the way our cities run in Oklahoma, for instance, we are by state constitution, our cities cannot operate off of property taxes. We operate off of sales taxes. Well, sales taxes cannot be generated. They're generated from businesses, but they can't be generated in a community where the business can't thrive. The business can't thrive where there are no people. And so it's all connected. And so understanding that we first need a density. That's why I started out talking about, when you talk about districts, you're creating a density, you're creating a group of people, or a group of an entity, or of like-minded goals. And so, for instance, when you talk about a business district, and there's so much push in Oklahoma City, for instance, in districting. Well, why is that? Because these business owners understand that when they come together and they form merchant associations and they decide to organize under the umbrella of moving their economics forward, they know they are more powerful together. But they also cannot do that when there aren't people. And so we understand from a city governing standpoint, from a planning perspective, you need people before you need businesses. And so when you talk about, it's frustrating to have, for instance, a politician, and I'm not speaking of any politicians in general, so don't take that the wrong way. I don't do the politics, but I'm just, in general, we so often, and it doesn't matter what city in America, I mean, every city in America will have someone get up in our communities and talk about the disinvestment, i.e. we don't have grocery stores, we don't have, hardware stores, we don't have gas stations. Well, all of those are private businesses. A grocery store is not an entity that comes from the city. They are private business owners who operate on a very, very small margin. That means if they operate on a small margin, they need a lot of people to make a profit. And so when the reason they don't come into our communities is because no one's there. They need to be located in a community that is dense, where they know that, for instance, they are going to be able to benefit from the amount of product or produce that is sold versus the price of it, because their margins are very, very small. So density, it's connected. Infrastructure in our communities, that's connected to tax dollars. Schools, that's connected to tax dollars. And so, and depending on what it is, it depends on where that tax pool is coming from. At the end of the day, when we don't come back to our communities, when we don't commit to building and staying in our communities, then by virtue of just pure economics, our communities will fall. And somebody's going to come in and occupy at some point. They're going to come in and occupy and make it thrive, because they've had the advantage of knowing how it works for so long.
Yeah, I'm curious, right? So to this notion of density. So I think there's just so many wonderful threads that have come out of this part of the conversation. Thinking through the density, I want to talk a little bit more about maybe the should part of my question, right? So how do we get that density? And what I'm really asking is, how do you imagine the beloved community, right? The density will come as people can envision. And right into the conversation that we had earlier, we have many issues, and one of them is a shortage of vision, right? Especially for those younger who don't have a before that they can conjure up, right? So what does that beloved community look like? How do we create that beloved community that translates to that density, right, that you're referring to? Yes.
Well, I don't want to jump right in. Somebody else may want to jump in before me, but let me just say this one thing. I think for those of us who are in our communities now, who have not gone, we've not left, I think it's important for us to value that asset that we have, okay? And we just have to value that asset that we have. If we are owners of that asset, if we have the wherewithal, or even if we don't think we have the wherewithal, let's pursue being educated and understanding, well, how do I upgrade my house, for instance? How do I build the house in the bigger house, say, for instance, because lifestyle has changed, I need more space. What do I do to improve the property that I have? It's amazing how one person on one block doing that, the impact that can have on your neighbor, or the next person who wants to build on that vacant lot that's on your street, for instance. Communities all over the country, usually traditionally African American communities, are being transformed every day. And those communities that were, whose property values were low and diminished, are now multi-million-dollar communities. I have a friend here in Oklahoma City who lived in Dallas for some time. And she lived in a community, and it was a typical early Dallas community close to downtown. Her house is a simple house. She was planning on upgrading it. Investors are offering her almost $1 million for her home. And all they're going to do is scrape it. They're going to tear, if she sells, everyone in her community has sold. If she chooses to sell, they're going to tear that house down and they're going to build a bigger home. Why couldn't we do that? Your land value is lower. Value you paid years or decades ago, right? That land value has appreciated, and now you have the same opportunity to rebuild on that property, go to the bank, do what the other investors are planning on doing, and you have done it cost that's considerably less than what that investor is going to do. If you choose, if staying in your community is what you value. So that's that's where I would start. Certainly then there's other things that you can overlay on that next step in terms of recruiting young African American families, and there are other technical things and other things that you do within city planning and city government to advocate for your areas, et cetera. But I think, when you talk about the beloved city, I think no one recognizes how much you love your city or your community if your house is falling apart.
Let me say real quick here, one thing that I saw and learned growing up in the Greenwood community was that we had families of various socioeconomic levels living in the community. And the one thing that you were taught was no matter what you had, how little or how big, you were proud of that. And basically they taught us that, it's a process to get to where you want to be and to do. Yes, some people can go and build that big house really quick, but some of us, we have to take the stages that it takes to do that. And that's okay. And and we need to understand that that is okay. Because when you finally get to that process so many years later, you will be so proud of that. But no matter where you are, be proud of it and keep it as if you have that pride. And we show each other that pride and help each other. So.
Absolutely, bravo.
Ms. Townsend, you made a great point about that beloved community that Dr. King talked about, that global vision where we can all share in the wealth. And I go back to what I was saying before. It's all about Black love. And we have to go back to that. And we have to unpeel those layers of internalized racism so we can heal and come again with those shared principles and values. Greenwood was a beloved community. In Greenwood, if you wanted to start a business, they were going to help you do that. It wasn't, no, my family is okay, y'all are not. It was an uplifting community. Greenwood was more than just turning the dollar more than 15 times. It was a community that supported each other. And not only did Greenwood support each other, but they were over 50 Black townships that all had a network of community supporting each other. When Greenwood was rebuilt, it was those other 50 Black townships that helped rebuild it. And so those are the things of community that's important to talk about and to teach, because we have to start building that community. Because until we build that community, you can't talk to someone about you should be owning your home and this is how you should keep your home, because we are dealing with hurt people who have been traumatized this through our DNA. And even when you have a home, you still have to come together and fight to keep those homes, because here's the thing here that's going around in this country. We have discrimination with home appraisals. Homes in North Tulsa are valued less than identical homes in South Tulsa. Brookings did a study, and I wrote the notes down, but this Brookings said that in Tulsa, the percentage difference between Black homes and white homes was 39.9%. That's a price difference of $23,388. Look at that wealth that's dropping, right? There's something, it's not right. And I looked up Oklahoma City. Oklahoma City is $14. So what's going on in Tulsa that's not going on in Oklahoma City? Where these values are changing, and then just across the country. And I keep saying, and I'm gonna keep pushing this fact. Every time people hear me talk, I always say this, but on the eve of the Civil War, Black people owned 0.5% of the wealth in this country. In 2010, Black people owned 0.5% of the wealth in this country. With all the degrees, right, with a Black president, we owned 0.5% of the wealth in this country. Today, we're on 1% of the wealth in this country. Something systemically is still happening. So that beloved community that we need, we have to educate ourselves and build the courage in ourselves to speak out about these issues. And what happens is we have a lot of successful Black people who find themselves in these successful positions, but they don't want to speak out about things to change things, because they're thinking about, I got to keep this house, I have to keep my livelihood, I have to keep my way of life. But they are in the meetings sometimes where it matters, but a lot of times we're not. We think we're at the table, but we're really not, because while we're here, people up here making all the decisions, right? So we have to really go back to building ourselves and creating those shared values and those shared principles that we agree on, so we can operate as an organized unit to build our communities back. We have to get to that, and we're dealing with a country that attacked itself twice. This country attacked itself twice, right? The Civil War, the War on Civil Rights, attacked it twice. So this is what we're dealing with. And our mayors know this, our governors know this, the presidents know this. The Kerner's report, they simply ignored all the recommendations in that report. They don't want to change this thing, and when we talk about reconciliation has just become a money booming business. No one wants to create the solutions. We keep talking about the problem. You get paid to study the problem, but no one wants to find the solutions, because finding the solutions ends a lot of money for white folk. It ends a lot of money. So we have to come together, put principle over the dollar so we can build. And here's the thing, if Greenwood could do this in the face of white supremacy, what in the hell is stopping us from doing it now? What is stopping us from doing it now? And it's the fact that we cannot come together and, again, create shared principles and values. And I keep saying, I don't like Juneteenth because I feel like we party way too much. And I think Juneteenth should be a time when we come together to create those shared principles and values. Let's get that out the way first, then we can have a little fun. But each year, let's come back and measure. How have we done in education? How have we done in economic development? How have we done in land ownership? How have we done in health? We have to start measuring these things for ourselves and figure out, okay, what can we do better this time? What did not do this time? We have to start being proactive about that. And we have to also start figuring out ways to defend ourselves from this white supremacist system that we are operating in. And that's just real. And we have to stop aligning with white supremacy. And we do it unconsciously, but we are doing it. And so I just want to get back to that, because I think that's truly important if we're going to build a beloved community that Dr. King talked about, because that's about humanity. Because when we tackle humanity from all races of people, you're not going to like anybody who's suffering, who's hungry, who's homeless. So we have to go back to that.
You're muted, Erica.
Thank you. I have an ornament that says you're on mute 2021. It's clearly into 2022. I was saying that as I knew would be the case, this has been such a great conversation, and really just starting conversation. We are almost out of time. We have one question in the chat that I do want to pose, and then a final question that I will pose that we can't necessarily answer, but I think is maybe a good one to leave on the table for us all to consider more. The question in the chat is, at what point do you consider preserving a property or building versus tearing down and rebuilding within the African-American community?
Well, for me, I think I mean, there are obviously tools that you can use to value the property and make that decision if you tend to be more of a person who's driven by the numbers. I mean, the numbers are the numbers, regardless of where they're derived from. But I tend to be probably a little more emotional about my property, and probably not advised to do how I value a property. It is primarily emotional to me. If that property, for instance, holds something dear to me in terms of the community, or in terms of, if I grew up there, or even if, my mother lives in the same house and has lived in the same house now for, I guess, almost 45, 50 years now. And she has taken good care of her home, but she's 90 years old now. And there are things in the home that probably need to be changed. And so, I've been thinking very, very intently about, well, how do we start renovating the interior of the home? What do we do? What resources do we need to make that happen? And she probably will say, no, I'm not doing that. I'm 90 years old. I'm not going into that. But for me, it becomes something about legacy and having an asset that's there, that's meaningful to me. This on her street, there are several homes that are in need of repair. And so, why not dream and say, well, this person, if he's not going to fix the house up, let me see if I can buy it from him, and I don't know how I would do it. All I know is that I won't know how I can do it until I take that step. And it's amazing how once you take that step, I think things start to come to you. And that's what I mean about changing the narrative. I totally agree with Kristi from the standpoint where we should be talking about solutions and talking about how can I do this, not so much the things that have happened or the things that are keeping the barriers that are keeping me in check. I just refuse to allow anything to keep me in check or to be a barrier to me. And it is important to be at the tables, because if you are not at the table, I guarantee you, then you absolutely, decisions are being made that are impacting you and affecting you and impacting your community. And if no one is at the table to speak up and say something, then you're just going to be the beneficiary of somebody else's control. And so it's just important to make sure you can be at the table, move to the table, push people over to get at the table, do what you need to do to be at the table. And then don't be afraid to take steps. Don't be afraid to step out and do things that are outside of your comfort zone, even as it relates to your own properties.
And there needs to be more programs that help people to rehab their homes who can't afford to do so, because there are so many people in our community who can't afford to rehab their homes. And then a lot of times we need to teach our people how to leave wills, how to do trust, because a lot of times these homes go through probate, and a lot of families end up losing their homes that could have been passed down from generation to generation. So those are some things that we need to work on as well within our community.
For me, it's legacy. That has really meant a lot to me and my family over the years. I mean, as I've shared, to have a property in our family that is almost 100 years old, because we know what it took for our families to buy that property and to keep that property when so many other properties were taken away from us over the years on various platforms. But then again, if you have other properties, prioritizing, can this other property help me to keep this other property in check? We have to make those tough decisions sometimes though, but prioritizing what we do and how we do it surely does help quite a bit.
Well, I want to thank you all so much for joining us. I said I would end with a final question that I think that we've weighed in on. And so it's really a question in summation, right, rather than a new one. But I will leave us really with that question of whose work is this, right? We're talking about bringing people to the table, and of course another option is to create some new tables, right? So how are we going to proceed and that work. And that's obviously a question that we could spend much more time on, but unfortunately the clock has run out on this version of the conversation. So I want to thank you all. I want to thank our audience for spending this time together. And we look forward to seeing you around town, around the community, right? And also next month here on Changing the Narrative. So everybody have a great day.
Thank you, you too.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
And nice meeting you all.
Nice meeting you too.
Nice meeting everybody. It was a great conversation. Thank you.
It was.